I got a new set of strings recently, and these strings on my violin are getting kind of old, so today we're going to change them. Hello fellow instrumentalists, and welcome to the channel. I'm Jacques Gadway, this is Gadway Violin, and today we're changing our strings. Before you start just removing strings from your instrument, let's go over what you'll need. When you're ready to change your strings, you'll need a new set of strings, of course. You'll also need something called peg compound or peg dope, and also you will need a graphite pencil. Outside of these material requirements, you will also need to be proficient in tuning with the pegs. If you're not comfortable tuning with the pegs, then you should definitely not be changing your own strings. If you have all four of these prerequisites, you are ready to change your strings. Before we change our strings, let's talk about all four of these components that we need in order to succeed. First, let's talk about tuning with the pegs. In order to tune with the pegs, we like to use our left hand to find a good position on the peg that will allow us to move the peg comfortably in either direction, either by tuning down or by tuning up. When you move a peg, the first thing we want to do is loosen it so that we can move it comfortably. We do that by pitching the peg down ever so slightly to help us create some looseness in the peg. Whenever we tune with a peg, we always tune down first before we go up, even if the pitch we're desiring is above our current state. There's a couple reasons for this. The first reason is that pegs work through friction, and there are two kinds of friction. There is static friction and there is kinetic friction. In general, static friction is actually stronger than kinetic, meaning that to move an object that is currently stationary takes a greater deal of force than to move an object that is already moving through friction. This means that in order to initially move the peg, it takes more energy and more force than it does to continue moving the peg. So as a result, when you first move your peg, it is likely to jerk and jump. The second reason we go down instead of up is because if we jerk and jump at the start of moving our peg, we don't want that sudden rush of energy to be put towards tensioning the string or increasing the tension on the string. If we do that, a string can sometimes snap. So if we loosen the peg first, it allows us to get the peg moving in a smooth manner, but also prevents us from adding unnecessary sudden force to the string that can result in snapping. The final thing about moving the peg is that the pegs are not actually perfectly cylindrical. All that means is that they're slightly wedge-shaped, which means that as you push the peg into the peg box, they gain more width and actually have more resistance. And as you pull them out of the peg box, they get looser and they move more freely. So what we learned from this is that when we tune, one of our goals is to loosen the peg by allowing it to come a little bit out of the peg box, which it does naturally as you move it. But then as you get close to your desired pitch, you can slightly push into the peg box with your fingers to allow the peg to comfortably stick. Alright, so we reviewed how to move the pegs. Now let's get into changing the strings. The first thing I would suggest is when you're changing your strings, do not try to loosen all of the strings at once. This is going to cause your bridge to move and can actually cause your sound post within the instrument to move, and we want to avoid that at all costs. So to avoid that, we want to generally take one string off and replace it before we move on to another. You'll see a lot of information on the internet about the order of operations. You should take the G string off first, then you should replace it, then you should go to the E string, then you should do the D string, and then the A string. And honestly, I don't think that the order matters all that much. I think the important thing is that when you remove a string, you replace it with a new string before you go on to changing another. In this video, we're going to start with the G string, and then we'll continue on with the E string. We won't go through every string because it will become redundant. However, if you notice on my instrument, there's a difference between the tailpiece where the G string connects and where the E string connects. That's because, like most violinists, I have a fine tuner on my E string. It's very possible that if you're a beginner, you have a fine tuner on every one of your strings. And there's truly nothing wrong with that. There are different kinds of fine tuners, which may result in the way that I set up my fine tuner looking different than yours. But the general rules of thumb will apply regardless of what kind of fine tuner you have. Let's start with taking off the G string. You can do this virtually in any position. The one thing I would recommend is you generally deal with great changes in string tension with the strings facing away from you, so that in the event that they do snap, which almost never happens, they don't somehow snap into your face. So we're just going to go ahead and detune the G string. We just continue loosening comfortably until the string comes out of the peg. At some point, the string will be so uncoiled that you'll be able to just pull it straight out of the little hole that's inside of the peg. On this end of the instrument, since I don't have fine tuners on the G string, you'll notice that I have what's called a ball end string. This ball end string is what we need to purchase if we want to change back to the same position. So I don't plan on changing to any new fine tuners or anything, so I have to make sure that when I purchase a new set of strings, that they're going to match the old set. Because in this case, I need a ball end string in order to change properly on my violin. Once you remove the string that you're going to change, you're going to use 2 of your 3 components. The first thing that I like to do is take my graphite pencil and give a little bit of graphite to the notch on the bridge, as well as a little bit of graphite to the notch on the nut here by the peg box. This graphite serves primarily to lubricate the strings when you're tuning. It just makes it a little bit easier and less jittery when you tune with the pegs. After that, I take my peg dope or peg compound, and it says here to be applied sparingly on the peg. You take the peg out of the peg box, and where you see the black lines where there's wear and tear on the peg, that tells you where you should probably be applying the peg compound. So we're going to find those wear lines, which are pretty significant on my pegs, and we're going to apply this peg compound sparingly. That is going to translate to roughly 3 dashes if you want a rule of thumb, and 3 on each of those bands. Then I like to put the peg back into the peg box, and I like to twist it a little bit to allow those 3 marks that I made on each of the bands to evenly separate. Now we can set the violin down for a second and open up the new string. I got a brand new pack of one of my favorite strings. This is Larson Originals. They're a very soft sounding string. I have no affiliation with them, but they just are really pretty and they're not all that expensive. So I thought I'd give them a shout out. Now I bought the entire pack, but I'm not going to use the E string. I'm actually going to use a different E string because there's a specific E string that I like. In this case, because we just took the G string off, we're going to use the G string. It's very clearly listed here. We're going to open it up. What I like to do is I like to take the G string out, and I like to immediately take my old G string, coil it up, and place it inside of this bag or this pouch. It's not really a bag. And the reason I like to do this is because it's important to have spare strings in case your strings pop or in case a colleague of yours has a string that pops. It's great to have extra strings, but it's not always a great idea to have a bunch of extra new strings, because if you need to play on a moment's notice after snapping a string and you put a brand new string on there, it's going to take a while for your instrument to get used to it. In fact, it can take sometimes a couple of days before your instrument stops detuning. When you take a used string instead, your instrument is going to likely acclimate a lot quicker, and you can play a concert without having to worry about it detuning so significantly. And I like to put the old string in the pouch that the new one came from, partly because it tells me it's a G string. It's a nice way of organizing. And also because it lets me know this is the newest old string that I have, right? Even sometimes when my G string that I'm putting in here is not a Larson original, it's not important as long as I know it's a G string and it's used and I can rely on it if my G string snaps. So we take the new G string, we open it up, our peg is prepared, we've put graphite on both the bridge and the nut, and we're ready to change the string. I always like to start with the peg side first. We know where that is on the string very easily because in this particular case, I purchased ball end strings, and the ball end is always going to be where the tailpiece is, whereas the other end, which is usually going to have a longer colored part, is going to be where the peg box is. So we take that colored part and we just stick it, threading it through that circle. Make sure whenever you do this, whatever string it is, that you try to keep your string on the correct side when you enter. So I don't want to enter in between the D and A string, for example. I want to make sure that I enter on the G string side. Now I like to make sure that I pass the string through enough that I can actually turn the peg and have the end This is hard to do with one hand. Come out. And I want to make sure that my first loop of the string ends up on the opposite side that we will end up winding. Since the G string will be entering in from the left and going to the right, I want my very first wind to be on the right side of the notch. After that first notch, we can freely move to the other side, and then we just want to wind as tightly as possible while slowly making our way to where the string is coming from the nut as straight as possible to the peg. We don't want a big angle, so we want to make sure that we're winding in such a way that the string ends up coming from the peg almost directly above wherever the nut is. We don't want to tune up too much because we want to make sure we have enough slack on it to get this ball end into the hole. And if we make sure that we still have some color, that's probably going to be slack enough to find that hole. And I like to just pull the string so there's a little bit of tension, but there's some nice curve on the bottom. And I just stick that curve right through the hole and then bring it in. And we want to maintain that tension so that we don't lose the hole. And we can do that by using our thumb on our right hand. And as we do that, we just start tightening again. And once it gets to the point where it's just on the bridge and the nut, we no longer need to be adding any tension to the string. And usually you'd have a tuner here, but since my A string I think is still relatively in tune, we can find what our G should be. Da-da. And usually I tune it a little bit higher than the goal note because as we have new strings, when they tighten for the first time, they end up actually losing some of their tension, and we end up with a great deal of difference from where you tune it to where it ends up in just a few minutes. Already you can hear that that G has dropped tremendously. And that's not because the peg has moved at all. This is another reason why I make sure to save my old strings. As you can see, in the event of losing a string and needing to change it for a concert the same day, we might end up with a new string being on stage and having a wildly out of tune instrument by the halfway mark. Alright, so we've tuned the G string. We're going to jump over to the E string, our highest, our thinnest string. This is the string that acclimates actually the quickest on the instrument, but it's also the string that burns out the quickest. When you buy a new set of strings, I always recommend that you buy a couple extra E strings because simply by changing the E string, you can give your old set of strings a little bit of new life, and you can extend the amount of time that you have an old set before needing to buy a brand new set of strings. For this, I really like these gold brocade strings. I think that's how you say it. They're so cheap. They're like $2 or maybe $3. And I usually buy quite a few of them so that I can change my E strings regularly. The E strings are not like G strings where this might take a while till it stops going really, really flat. The E strings might take a day to acclimate to your instrument, and then they'll be comfortable, bright, and beautiful. Once again, the first thing we're going to do when we're changing our string is we're going to take it and we're going to loosen it. Again, I like to take my thumb and just put pressure on the fingerboard so that when I loosen dramatically the E string, there's a little bit of buffer before that affects the bridge. That's kind of just a personal preference. I don't think it's absolutely necessary. And in the case of the E string, I'm actually not going to save this E string because I have so many new ones, and like I said, the new E strings don't take as long to acclimate to the instrument, so we don't really need to keep the old E strings unless you want to. But in my case, I ended up buying 5 E strings this time, so I don't think I'm going to need this. The steps from here are basically the same that you saw before. We're going to take our pencil that's graphite, we're going to put a little bit of graphite on the bridge, we're going to put a little bit of graphite on the nut. We're going to take the peg, the E string peg out. We're going to find those weathered bands, and we're going to apply sparingly, meaning we're going to do 3 strikes on each of those bands. 1, 2, let's do a third one over here. 3, and 3 on the other one. 2, 3. So you can see this is all the same as we did with the G string. We'll put the peg back in the peg box, and of course we're going to turn it around a few times to get that peg dope to even out. Then we take our new string, our new E, and we're not going to put the old one in there because we're just going to throw it in the garbage. Something you'll notice about the E string that's different than the G string is that there's no ball, and that's because my fine tuner requires me to have a what's called loop end. You can see from this angle that there is a little hook right by the fine tuner, and it's on that hook that we'll put the loop end of the E string. But just like with the G string, we don't start with the hook end or the ball end in the G string's case, or the tail piece if we want to be general. We're going to instead start on the peg side. So we're going to find the end of the string that doesn't have the loop or ball. In this case, that's this golden side. And we're going to again, remember that we're not going to enter the peg box in between the D and A string. We're going to make sure to enter it on the E string side, on that fully far side. Which means that we probably have to bring the peg out a little bit so that the whole of it will be in a comfortable spot. In fact, I have to pull my peg so far out that it's actually not in both sides. You can see that there's a gap, which allows the hole to be in the correct spot. Otherwise, the rules are going to be the same. We stick the string through the hole. We make sure that there's some on the other side. We make sure that our first loop that our excess string makes is on, in this case, the left side before we start coiling on the other side. And again, the goal of our coiling is to make sure that our string comes straight down from where it leaves the peg. We don't want it to come from a strong angle. Once we feel like we've done a little bit on the peg, we're going to make some tension on here, and we can retain tension here by just grabbing with our fingers. And then with the slack here, we're going to find that hook, and we're going to simply put it around it, and then again create tension with our thumb in the right hand. Actually, in this case, because we are going to be using our right hand for the peg box, we'll switch to the left hand thumb to create that tension. And we'll just begin tuning until we get a nice coil and the string makes contact with the bridge and nut. Once the string makes contact with the bridge and nut, you'll notice in this case on my E string we have this little plastic covering. And this little plastic covering is for the bridge. Because the E string is so thin, it can sometimes actually cut through the wood of the bridge. This plastic covering protects your bridge from any damage. In some people's instruments, their bridge itself has a padding, so you don't need this plastic covering. But if your bridge does not have that padding, I would recommend you use the plastic covering just to spare yourself any future unnecessary repairs or replacements for your bridge. Once that's in place, you can just start tuning your E string. This one's a scary one, and sometimes it does break. So again, at some point, I would recommend you face it away from you, just so you don't get hit if anything happens. Once again, I recommend that you tune it a little bit higher than your desired pitch because it's going to settle. Another suggestion is if you're tuning a string that has a fine tuner, I would go ahead after you change strings and loosen the fine tuner quite a bit, because over the course of having a string on your instrument, you're likely to mainly tighten the fine tuner, which can result in it kind of being in a shallow position. If we loosen it at the beginning of every time we change our strings, we have a lot more runway to change and alter our pitch as we tune with the violin. So it's kind of a fine tuner reset if we do this. So we've changed our G string and our E string. I'm now going to go on my own and change the A and D string as well. I'm not going to do that for the video because I think it's clear with knowing how to do the G string and the E string, how to do the rest of your strings as well. Another question I get asked is how often should I change my strings? And the answer to that question depends heavily on how much you play. In my case, I play all the time, constantly performing, practicing, teaching, and my violin's just getting played and projecting and vibrating almost all the time. And as a result, I have to change my strings pretty frequently. But if you're someone who plays about an hour per day or less, you can probably get away, honestly, with changing your strings close to once per year. Either way, though, whatever you decide to do in terms of your frequency for changing your strings, I would highly recommend that you sprinkle in between those intervals, changing at least the E string. This will give your violin new life each time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was helpful. If there's any violin concepts you'd like me to make a video about in the future, please don't hesitate to leave those in the comments below. Also, in the comments below, let me know how often you changed your strings. I change my strings, or try to, at least every 6 months, but ideally, if I was made of money, I'd be changing them probably every 3 months. it just is not, I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty expensive. Even these pretty affordable strings, when you consider the market value of strings, are very expensive. The Larsons go for somewhere between $80 and $90, and that's just not cheap. But the truth is, when it comes to changing your strings, it's worth going for a nice option. You don't have to get the most expensive strings, but it's going to make a big difference in your violin playing. I'll leave a link below for peg compound. I won't leave a link for strings because honestly, you probably shouldn't be buying strings off of Amazon. There's a little bit of uncertainty as to how legitimate those strings are. If you want to buy strings, I recommend you do so off of Fiddler Shop, sharmusic.com, or the best option is going to your local violin shop. Thanks again for watching and happy practicing.